That was okay. After they do that, I always kind of think you don't really need to hear a sermon, but I wrote one, so here we go. Also, to those of you who are used to me wandering all over the place, I absolutely promised the stream team I would stay in the pulpit today. So if you see me tempted, chastise me. Every year on this day when I leave the house, I take a picture from the front stoop of my house of the city all dark with the lights of the city still visible and post it saying, while it was still dark. In the gospel stories, regardless of who's narrating it, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, this is the narrative device that begins the story, while it was still dark, or as Luke, at early dawn. Maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Not of Jesus' story, my story. Let's go back to last night. I was really tired early, and I was trying to keep myself awake because if I go to bed early, I then wake up at midnight and don't know what to do with myself. So I promised Danielle we'd watch a couple shows that she likes to watch with us, and then I went to sleep at 10:30, which means I woke up at 2:30 and didn't know what to do with myself. It was more than my typical fact that I just don't sleep on Saturday night because sermon is churning through my head. And it was more than just the typical, I tend to wake up at 2:30 or 3 and stay awake for a while because all manner of thoughts are churning through my head. There was something more to it than those typical reasons, a sense to which I just couldn't find my place. I actually got up and walked around the house. I relocated myself several times. I tried the couch, I tried the chair. I realized that I looked like Goldilocks in my own house. I got back into bed a couple times, and every single time, nothing was restful and nothing fit my state of mind. There was anticipation in me. For the women named in these gospel accounts, who are in all of them the first witnesses and the first preachers of the resurrection, there is anticipation in them, captured by this little phrase, while it was still dark. In the Jewish naming of times, a day begins at the evening hour. So when Jesus is hanging on the cross at crucifixion, it becomes a matter of haste that they need to speed things up because the Sabbath will begin on Friday night, because that will then be actually Saturday. So the crucifixions in the text are cut short. They didn't want them hanging all throughout the Sabbath day, and they could not do work on the Sabbath day, and so they rushed the crucifixions and the burials while it was still light in that twilight hour. They threw a body in a tomb with haste, sealed it up, and began the Sabbath. And I've always been struck that it had to be an excruciating Sabbath day. Jesus is dead. All the burgeoning hope climaxing in Palm Sunday is gone. Divine messianic promises dashed to nothingness. So many questions churning, so much despair. Promises gone. All they could do was walk around the house to find a place they could settle in. But it's more than just these cosmic questions plaguing the women. You see, their friend died. Not the Son of God, not the Son of Man, not the Messiah of all, not the King of the Jews, their friend. and they couldn't see to his burial properly. They couldn't wash and cleanse. They couldn't put the spices wrapped in his body. They couldn't cry on his corpse and grieve. And so I imagine they're a mess. They're a mess with anticipation, waiting for the first light on Sunday morning to go to the tomb to do that which should have been done on Friday night. And Luke tells us these women took what they needed to the tomb to attend to his body, but when they got there, the stone was rolled away, and there was no body. And it says they were perplexed. What a word, perplexed. Say it with me because it's fun to say. Perplexed. I have to imagine that if you had asked them how they felt, they would have given you nothing. Right? Staggered beyond words are they. Perplexed is a retrospective word. I have to imagine that with weeks of building anticipation and crushing disappointment, their abject despair is now cast to a place that there no longer is a measuring rod for. His body is gone. Perplexed is a word. Undone is the word that comes to me. In the Acts, Luke, who wrote today's gospel text, also is the author of Acts. He uses the same word, but we translate it differently. We translate it that they are at a loss of how to investigate it. I love that. Have you ever just stared at something and you are so caught in the what is this, that you don't know how to begin to answer those questions? I love that Grace wrote them so against the darkness of the tomb you can barely make out the questions as they could barely get them out of their mouth, at a loss to investigate this. Because it's not just that things aren't the way it's supposed to be, it's that this is the last straw. I don't know how long the women stood there. I wonder about that sometimes. Text has no meter to it. Maybe they stared into that tomb, dumbfounded, perplexed, undone, speechless, for hours. I have to imagine that had not what happens next happened, they'd be standing there still. But while they are in an ongoing state of perplexedness, of unknowing how to investigate, suddenly two men appear, dazzling. I just think of bedazzled glitter. And they automatically on their knees, terror-stricken. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you up there in Galilee? The Son of Man will be handed over to sinners and crucified, and on the third day he will rise again. Why do you look for the living among the dead? Why are you perplexed? Don't you remember? Remember. I love the word. Even the fact that the word member sits within remember. When we remember things, we are membered into that knowledge. We run across this word a lot in our Lenten journey. We run across this word a lot in our entire lives. What do we remember? What do we not remember? I have one of those shirts. It's a little weird because my brother-in-law gave it to me. It said, "My wife told me two things. One is that I don't listen very often and I don't remember the other one." Memory forms who we are, and so when we don't remember, it is not just disconcerting, it is losing our identity. We've been thinking about memory throughout Peter's journey, and we've been tracking Peter. How did Peter go from being a fisherman who wanted nothing to do with Jesus to the patriarch of the church who would die on Jesus' behalf? Peter, who spoke for all those who would name themselves followers of the way of Jesus by the end of his journey. How did this guy become that guy? We've tried to follow in Peter's footsteps in his journey of growth, looking at these little blips, these little instances, these little interactions between Peter and his newfound friend Jesus. These instances we often call failures, but they were formative for Peter in the way of Jesus. Peter couldn't walk on water, but he learned that Jesus would rescue him. Peter wanting to build booths for Elijah and Moses and Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration because he was perplexed by what all this mean. Peter telling Jesus he couldn't suffer and die because Peter needed him. And Jesus rebuking him for setting his mind on human things. Along this journey, we could say that Peter failed fervently, but all of these failures were formative. I would argue that the character and depth of leadership and abundant nerve we see in the Peter of the book of Acts is only possible because of, not in spite of, the way he failed forward as he followed his teacher and his friend, creating memory, deep and abiding memory of the steadfast love of God, the resolute vision of Jesus, and the unrelenting care for all creation. Peter never failed, he was formed. His memory was formed. Do you not remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee? Speaking of going backwards, let's go back another 500 years. I spent time in college as a philosophy major and spent a lot of time reading what we might call the works of Socrates, but Socrates never wrote anything. Much like Jesus, he said a lot of things, and his students wrote it down. Most of what we have comes from Plato. There's a lot of similarities between Jesus and Socrates, other than the Son of God thing. Socrates, like Jesus, asked far more questions than he gave answers. Socrates, like Jesus, came up in a tradition, but moved in that tradition in radically different ways, not in rejection of, but in fulfillment of. Socrates, like Jesus, provoked unsettling thoughts that unsettled the power structures of their day, and Socrates, like Jesus, died for it. On the eve of Socrates' death, in a book called Phaedo, he begins to have a conversation about learning and knowledge, which is like honestly 90% of what Socrates talks about. But in this particular forth, this idea that we are not born as blank slates, but we actually have all knowledge coded into our being. And that when we learn, it's not that we're learning something we don't know, it's that we're remembering something we didn't know we already knew. That's why Socrates says, you go, aha, calculus suddenly makes sense to me. You've never said that? It's why we get these aha moments, because it's not that we just learned it, it's that the knowledge fell into place. We've had it. We just did not remember. And I love this idea. Set aside current contemporary cognitive ideas about whether that's possible or not. I don't care. It's the remembering I love. And I love this idea that coded into our DNA, into our genetic being, into our ancestral memory is all the knowledge we need. We just can't remember. Do you not remember what he told you while he was still in Galilee? All of our texts of Jesus' life and death are full of so much foreshadowing that as a reader, it's amazing the disciples were not like, oh yeah, he talked about this. Right? 3 times in most of them, 4 times in Matthew, he tells them, I'm going to die and in 3 days rise again. It's pretty clear. It's not even subtle foreshadowing. Which brings me back to this word again, perplexed. When we're overwhelmed, when we're so at a loss that we do not know how to begin to investigate truth, it's not that we don't have knowledge. It's that our personhood is frozen. We're paralyzed. Grief and trauma and fatigue. Oh, what it would have been if the women could have just had a good night's sleep. These things paralyze us, and the women are perplexed, cut off from their own memory, from what they know to be true. Luke goes on with the story. It tells us that now these people who have seemed so out of sorts, they didn't even have names, they were just bodies moving around in the dark. So in grief, so paralyzed, they weren't really themselves. But once Epiphany happens, they're named again. They remember not just what Jesus said, but who they are. And Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women, they go and they tell the apostles this news, remembered into themselves again, remembered into the abundant, rising life of Christ. They go to tell the old story, to kindle the memory of their friends about their friend. And the apostles toss it off as an idle tale. But, well, we know Peter's pretty good at being wrong. He's been there before. He's failed and been formed by it. So Peter doesn't scoff when the others do. Peter starts running to the tomb, running because Peter has been taught by Jesus to imagine the unimaginable, running because Peter knows that the stories that involve Jesus don't end the way most stories do. Peter, who runs to the tomb, stoops in and sees cloths with no body. And he was amazed. This is what the text says. Then he went home amazed at what happened. I love the word amazed too. It's the perfect parallel to perplexed. Both ends of the spectrum. In the Greek, it means astonished out of our senses. Peter's brain wasn't working either at this point. It's just instead of the awful, it's the awesome. The other end of the emotional spectrum in which our intellect shuts down and we simply feel. And he feels empowered. And the text says he goes home this way. And I don't know where that means he went, because Peter's home is a couple days' walk away. Does he go back to where the disciples had been staying in Jerusalem? Does he, so caught up in this story, walk all the way back to Galilee only to get there and say, I didn't come for the milk, and I just left all my friends back at Jerusalem? He is amazed, caught up in the maze of his emotion, of his awe. They were stunned, but with the little teaser they gave him, Peter is blown away. Every year, I take my picture standing on the stoop in the dark, struck by how fitting a narrative device this is, while it was still dark. Because Easter doesn't happen when you expect it. Easter isn't something you can intellectualize yourself in. Easter isn't something that happens when things are going well. It doesn't happen on a timeline. Resurrection, by its very nature, happens when we are at the lowest of our lows, when everything has been lost. And before we can even check in, life is already finding a new way to break forth from the grave. The women did not get ahead of Jesus. The stone was already rolled away. Peter does not get ahead of God, and we do not know how this story ends, no matter how many times we read it, because it's still breaking forth in our lives today. You cannot catch up to abundant life. The story is still out in front of us while it is yet dark. We've been using sermon themes from the hymn, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. This one comes from the middle hymn, Here and I Hope. It's the hymn that everyone has the most questions about, because it says, Here I raise my Ebenezer, and everyone's like, what is that? It is not Scrooge, though he gets his name from it. 1 Samuel chapter 7, the Lord saves Israel from an invading Philistine army, and Samuel raises a stone to help them remember that rescue. And he calls the stone Ebenezer. Thus far, he says, the Lord has helped us. And Ebenezer is a standard, a herald, a memorial, so we do not forget our ancestral knowledge that even when it looks like despair has won, life is already out in front of us. Here I raise my Ebenezer, here by thy great help I've come, and I hope by thy safely arrive at home. All right, I just lost it. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He, to rescue me from danger, interposed his precious blood. Memory is what stands between us and despair, what stands between us and being at a loss for where to investigate, what stands between us and death. Memory is what tethers us to the faith of Jesus. The faith that when Jesus rises, we are raised up with him. And I hope. And I hope that in a world that looks all too much like it's still dark, while the world is caught up in wars and rumors of wars, while envy and strife abound, while hunger and poverty hold grip like a tomb on far too many people, while it was still dark, I hope. Life is breaking down walls, opening up soil, and springing forth anew. This is our Ebenezer. This is our unrelenting belief. Let us run and catch up to God on the loose, emptying tombs and spreading love. We have work to do, my friends. Do you not remember? He is risen.